Let's not focus on the floor. Focus.
I like that idea because it was kind of a forgotten state university. Best cross country team in the country, just because they do. 7,000 people. My brother goes there. My mom is 8. Yoga is way better than this. I actually like Tucson's a nicer city. I love Tucson. It's everybody in Arizona hates it. It's like, oh, it's a dream. It's the only city in Arizona that has an actual history and culture.
Au contraire, I live in one of the most historical cities in Arizona.
I mean, big city. What city did you live in?
Yuma.
Oh, the ratio of 3 to 10.
Yuma was the most beautiful place I've ever been. Twice a day, 30 minutes around sunrise and 30 minutes around sunset, and the rest of the time was pure hell.
Well, since we're here, I'm gonna just. I think this is on. Okay. Did you hit record? Okay, we're gonna be recording this, but this is largely informal. But thanks everybody for joining us. My name is Jessica Alcott-Ilmo. I am from the American Security Project. We are a DC-based nonprofit organization that hosts our National Climate Security Tour. We travel around the country putting together these panels to highlight climate as a national security issue. And I'm really pleased to have this great panel today. With us, we have Lieutenant General John Castellaw, U.S. Marine Corps retired and a member of ASP's Consensus for American Security. We have Dr. Aurora Sherrard, which I said correctly, the Executive Director of Sustainability at the University of Pittsburgh, and really knows all things sustainability. So I'm a huge fan. Thank you for being with us. And Mr. Grant Irvin, Director of Environmental, Social, and Governance and Innovation Practices at S&B USA. So thank you all for being here with us today. We've got about an hour. I've got some prepared questions that I'm going to pose to the panelists, and then if anybody has a question in the audience, you can just feel free to ask it. I think there's small enough space here that we can hear you. You can direct your questions to whoever. So I want to start, our title of our panel today is Sustainability in the Steel City. And we actually started our National Climate Security Tour here in Pittsburgh more than 10 years ago. This was our first place that we ever visited. We've done these events in about 22 states. We've done more than 50 of them. And I'm really excited to be back in Pittsburgh because I'm a huge fan of Pittsburgh, because 2 of my best friends live here. But it's the steel city. It's been known as the place that built America with its steel industry. So it's a really interesting place to have developed as such a climate leader. So I'm going to pose the first question to both Grant and Dr. Sherrard. You both have been involved in sort of the evolution from the first climate plan in 2007 to the different climate plans at both the university and the city, and now with your businesses. What can you tell us about how this started, how it's evolved, and what sort of resistance that you've gotten along the way?
First climate action.
Sure. Well, I mean, I was actually going to say you should start with the collapse of the steel mills and. Okay. So, I don't know, maybe we should go back further than that. So, in the late 90s, I'm going to go way back. Pittsburgh was rebuilding its convention center. And there was a council member named Councilman Bob O'Connor, who was on the board of the Sports and Exhibition Authority. And he said, I don't want to just build another box. I want to do it better. What should we do? And so Green Building Alliance, which is the organization that I used to work for, stepped in and said, there's a new thing called green buildings. Let's build one. Let's pursue the LEED green building standard, which is now the default green building standard in the U.S. and a lot of countries. And so Pittsburgh was really on the forefront of green buildings, and that was emblematic of how the city was thinking at the time, right? So it wasn't just another building. It was how do we do things differently and better, knowing that it was recovering from the steel industry collapse, and it really needed to rethink itself as a place, but also everything that it was doing. And so, fast forward several years, Councilman Bob O'Connor, no, he was mayor then, Mayor Bob O'Connor, Councilman Bill Petito, and State Senator Jim Furlow said, what are we doing with city government? We really need to do more and to do better until they started looking at the greenhouse gas emissions of the city of Pittsburgh, ended up looking at the greenhouse gas emissions of essentially the entire Pittsburgh region and saying, government is important, but it is by far not the only contributor in this space. I think city emissions were only 4% of the city's whole. And so they brought together people across sectors to really look at Pittsburgh's climate impact and what the opportunities were, including people from business, higher education, the community, and government. And that's where the first climate action plan from the city came from.
Yeah. And I guess what I would add is that when you go deeper back, really after post-World War II, there was a moment in Pittsburgh's history that was effectively this confluence of both government and industry coming together to solve some of the deepest challenges, civic challenges of the city's time, and that was air quality. So the issue of pollution and all of that emissions that were being generated as a result of the production and the war effort really created an untethered environmental disaster. And so the first Clean Air Act was actually created here in Pittsburgh as a result of the confluence between Richard King Mellon, who was kind of the titan of industry at the time, and Mayor David L. Lawrence, who was kind of our version of Tammany Hall here in Pittsburgh in terms of leading the government effort. And so that ethos, you take that fast forward a little bit into the days of Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, and then you go a little bit further into kind of the 60s and 70s, where you start to see kind of a recognition of urban renewal and what it had done to communities, and that led to the advent of a deep-rooted community development industry here in Pittsburgh, where we had, I think at one point, like 40 community development corporations. And then you get to the point that Aurora speaks about in terms of this recognition that once again, the climate is impeding the economic and social progress of the city. And so together that climate action plan really became a springboard for the city. And when we say the city, it's not just municipal government. We're talking about kind of the community that is the city of Pittsburgh that starts to lead that effort forward. And then fast forward again to the kind of the most recent period of time when my boss was in office, Mayor William Peduto, so from 2014 to 2021, we had another great leap, I think, in terms of this civic and government and industry effort, which was led in large part, I think, because of the work that Aurora alludes to, but also because what we saw with the impacts, the negative externalities of the natural gas industry. And so you start to see this recognition of gas and what it does to local communities. Yes, there is a host of externalities and benefits that we can get into maybe later on in the conversation. It's a complex gas, it's a complex story. But it starts to create this recognition that there is a clean energy future, and that is important to the city's resilience, to its social development, as well as its economic development.
Great, thank you. So this is not only an issue for the city of Pittsburgh and the state of Pennsylvania, but this is also a national security issue. So General Constable, I want to turn to you now so you can talk a little bit about how the military and the security community in the United States has really begun to think sort of similarly in terms of conceptualizing climate as an opportunity, even though it's changing, how the service branches have each developed their own climate plans and how DoD is thinking about that and the way ahead there.
Thank you very much. I started my military career in the early 70s. It sort of coincided with the oil crisis. I think anybody but maybe one in this room was around when that occurred, but it started a lot of thinking about national security and about energy security, about food security, about the role of the military, and about what we would be concerned with. I eventually became a pilot, and when I was a young captain, I didn't worry about fuel, and I didn't worry about sustainability, and I didn't worry about climate. I never thought I had too much gas in my aircraft, except the one time I was on fire and wanted to get out before it did. But over the years, there's been changes in our perception. I'm the same year group as Jim Mattis. Some of you may, former Secretary of Defense, CENTCOM, just Jim to me. But what he said was free us from the being tied to energy. And so going through that area, then I started to see, and I think my peers did, how energy and climate and all were entwined. And I think the real time for me that it came clear was I was in the U.S. European Command at the time. We had responsibility for Africa, for the created African Command. And they, I ended up being the guy that they sent where they didn't want anybody else wanted to go. And so at that time, we were having threats of a coup in Chad and in Africa. And so they sent me down there. And what I found was the security situation was what we call being impacted by climate change as a threat multiplier. You had tribalism, you had issues with a non-functioning government and so forth, but then you had the desert coming south at about a mile a year. You had Lake Chad. It was amazing to fly over it. I've been going back. Last time I went back was a couple of years ago to watch that lake disappear. 200,000 fishermen were forced off the lake. They had to do something to feed their families. You had herdsmen look at the grass moving south, and what you created was a conflict between the fishermen, the farmers, and the herdsmen that destabilized the area and created the environment where insurgency could flourish. And so, another indicator about how climate change is coming in. So what did the military start doing about it? Well, one thing we started thinking about what we were doing. One of the biggest users of fuel in America, and we generate a lot of it. So, what can we do? And so we started looking at doing stuff like the Green Fleet. Anybody ever heard of the Green Fleet? Using biofuel, and but the biggest deal is that we started. How can we not use as much? And so we created organizations and people within to look at as we develop platforms. How much is the fuel cost going to be? How much are we going to use? How much are we going to contribute to the warming? And so we're mind is starting to think about that. Spent a lot of time traveling, and one of the places I went to was Kwajalein. Anybody ever heard of Kwajalein? Marshall Islands, over in, it's a big atoll. And we occupied it after World War II, and what it is a big target. We launch missiles from Vandenberg, and they land, payloads land inside the atoll. We've got U.S. Personnel all over the place. One of the interesting things is it's got a 18-hole golf course. You play front nine on Kwajalein, and then you get on a shuttle aircraft that takes you 60 miles to Roy, and you play the final nine up there. But what was happening, and what is happening, is that is one of the nations that's most impacted by rising sea level, and that eventually is going to impact our multi-billion-dollar facility and our ability to to measure and follow, what happens when we fire missiles and those types of things. And anybody ever been to a place called Paris Island, South Carolina, on the coast and everything? Man, it's hot, getting hotter. Now, what happens is as you train military, they have to operate in an environment, and you start getting days when the wet bulb factor is too hot to do training. And so it's impacting how well we're doing it. Norfolk is a great example also of sea level rise. It's the largest Navy base that we've got. The piers are getting a lot closer to the surface of the water for two reasons. One, sea level rise, and we're also taking too much water out of the ground in that area. So the attitude has changed. We're realizing it. We're starting to do those things on controlling our fuel, and going to net zero installations. We're talking about Tucson, the Air Force Base there, one of the first ones that went to put solar panels on the roof and so forth. So as you look across the military now, the fuel that we're looking at, I was reading Defense News coming up on the airplane yesterday. The Army is developing, electrical powered vehicles that will reduce that chain that Matt has talked about of logistics on doing that. We're going to figure out how to keep them charged up, but that is a challenge that I think we will quit wobbling now. I'm in the middle of getting the implants in the bridge, so forgive me if I slur my words more than usual. I got a regional dialectical speech impediment anyway, called it Southern drawl, so please, if you can't understand me, raise your hand and I'll speak a little faster.
Thanks, sir. So to sort of sum up that, the military is thinking about sort of climate in two major ways. One is as a threat multiplier, and that means that the military and the defense and security communities are not thinking that climate change will directly cause a conflict or cause issues in a place, but it undermines and exacerbates all of these existing issues. So if you have a partner nation or a nation where there's poor governance, or if they have sea level rise already, so something like Bangladesh, those places will concede more and more negative impacts of climate change. And so the military is potentially looking at being deployed in places where they either have not traditionally been, or they're going to be used in more non-combat circumstances. So more HADR missions, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief missions abroad, potentially more defense support to civil authorities domestically. But they're also thinking about their own emissions, as the general said, because DoD is a notorious emitter of greenhouse gases. So they're looking at how to retrofit their buildings and how to build better. So if you look at something like Tyndall Air Force Base that was completely leveled after Hurricane Michael in 2018, they're now trying to build back in a manner that exceeds what the expectations are and what the standards are. So with that, I'll turn back to Pittsburgh a little bit as an example, because the statistic I saw was that 80% of Pittsburgh's greenhouse gas emissions come from its buildings. So how should DoD be thinking about how to either build in a different way or retrofit their existing facilities? In your experiences, how have the buildings around Pittsburgh been able to get at that problem?
You lead off again, and I'll come back.
So, I spent over 10 years of my career on building performance and green buildings. And I think the Department of Defense has long been a leader in sort of driving that conversation across a number of unique types of facilities, right? I mean, not just a standard commercial office building, but bases and things like that, and really going beyond and thinking about infrastructure and how to make more sustainable infrastructure. Which is really important. The federal government overall has really embraced, the green building standards and performance goals that we talked about previously, and not just done that, but then continue to benchmark their buildings across not just energy and water, but also, indoor environmental quality, like external, occupant health and satisfaction and things like that. They have some of the best data sources out there from any owner. But I think there's always more that everybody can be doing, right? Pittsburgh being an urban area, obviously 80% of most urban areas are buildings contributing to impacts. And in Pittsburgh, we started building green buildings, like I said, in the late 90s. We're a very early leader there. After a number of years, one of the things that we realized as a region was we couldn't just focus on new buildings, right? We had to look at our existing buildings. We needed to figure out how to bring everybody along, even the smallest buildings, on our building efficiency journey. And so we started something called the Pittsburgh 2030 District. It was the third such area in the country. And we launched it in 2012. And what we did is we modeled it after something called the International 2030 Challenge, which looked at this challenge of buildings and said, well, what do we need to do? Well, it's very simple. Look at every existing building, draw a line in the sand, that baseline year, reduce your energy use, water use, and related transportation emissions, because that's that scope 3 emission for a lot of owners sometimes, 50% below those baseline levels by 2030. And at Building Alliance, we literally knocked on every owner's door in downtown Pittsburgh, worked with a bunch of community partners and said, will you commit to these goals? And people were like, maybe. Let me think about it. It was an entirely voluntary conversation. And, we got a number of people to say yes, and then we used peer pressure, because change is not just about systems and people and technology, it's about, us. Each of us in this room. And we launched the Pittsburgh 2030 District with, I think it was a little bit over 25% of all the square footage in downtown Pittsburgh, committed to those goals along with carbon neutral new buildings. And that was more than we thought we would get, which is great. And today, Green Building Alliance has over 550 buildings across Western Pennsylvania committed to those goals and all collaborating and working together to reach those goals. So it's a long way of saying, Feds has to set a goal, you have to get there. My advice would always be set a goal earlier than you think to get there. So, I work at an Institute of Higher Education. We have a carbon neutral goal by 2037. The global call is obviously carbon neutrality by 2050. Most universities who have a carbon neutral goal just set it at 2050 and chase it from there. I think what we all need to do is we all need to feel the urgency. We need to make those decisions sooner. We need to be making them now, yesterday. I work with a lot of undergraduate students who are sort of yelling this from the rooftops and the streets and asking the military, the U.S. government, higher education institutions, private entities to really do more and do it faster in the face of the climate emergency.
I mean, a couple things that you have a fan. A couple things I would add and lessons from that, because the city, we were participants in the 2030 challenge. And maybe for folks who are new to Pittsburgh and the space, this is a publicly owned building. While it's managed by a nonprofit entity, the space that you're in is a public facility, right? And so whenever you're on a military base or whenever you're in a local government facility, oftentimes we don't think of quality or high standards as being kind of the benchmark. And I think that's one of the big lessons. Just the other day, I was over at the Frick Environmental Center here in Frick Park, which is also a living building challenge certified structure that is owned by the city of Pittsburgh, but managed by a nonprofit organization. And it's delightful. It's a place that is enjoyable to be in. The folks that work there love the space. They're more productive, they're more energized. And so when you think about our military personnel and the facilities that they're in, having them in a quality space for the time that they're able to be in a space, I think is a really high standard for us to meet in order to take care of the men and women that serve our country. So that's number one. Number two, one of the big lessons that we learned through being a part of the 2030 challenge that Aurora talked about is that, actually I'm going to give you two lessons. One is the importance of setting that marker can drive policy, it can drive investment decision, It can, drive morale effectively. Everybody starts to talk about meeting the common goal and the objective. But the other lesson is that carbon equals costs. And so when we're thinking about reduction of CO2, no matter where you're at on kind of the political, ideological spectrum, I think we can all agree around cost management and the need to make salient investments and smart investments. And so when you think about that carbon factor, that is your fuel and electricity that you're consuming. And so how can you consume that in a higher quality manner, where it's locally sourced or more resilient for your uses, but also you have more control over it from a cost standpoint. So that reduces a lot of fluctuations as well as your dependency in terms of what your supply chains are. So the more that you can source closer and locally to you, that adds resilience to whatever mission you're on.
It's great. And this, Pittsburgh has been doing this evolution for a while. But in the past 2 years, we've seen some major federal legislation in the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the Chips and Sciences Act. But how is that funding going to expedite this process, or what kind of impact is it going to have on that moving forward?
Can I take that one? One of the things, we were a part of a program that we developed when I was at the city of Pittsburgh called the Marshall Plan for Middle America. And the concept around the Marshall Plan, obviously taking adage from the Marshall Plan after World War II, also in part because General Marshall came from southwestern Pennsylvania, Fayette County, I believe, to be exact. So we took a Pittsburgh regional boy, also in kind of giving the name to it. But the idea that you need to create a large catalytic investment in order to create this not just economic transition, but the environmental transition. And so the Biden administration has realized that through the Chips and Science Act, through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and through the Inflationary Reduction Act. So those three things together are a great catalyst in terms of putting investment on the street. The thing that I think is the challenge now, so Washington for once has done their part, right? They have delivered. The challenge now is going to be with those of us out in the field and in local government spaces, in the private sector and universities, to match and meet the moment to deliver. And that is the challenge we have right now, I think, in terms of creating capacity at the local level to go after those grants, to set up the deal structures, to envision what the projects are going to be, to write the grant to the Department of Energy or the Department of Transportation. And I think the other thing is there's a great need to create collaboration with the private sector also. Because what you see right now is this huge availability of resources from the federal sector as well as from the private sector. And local governments and state governments need to step up from a policy, investment, and a management standpoint in order to help connect those dots and deliver projects on the ground.
So everything Grant said, right on, right? This is like an unprecedented funding opportunity. However, we can't forget the third leg of the sustainability stool, which is people, right? Equity, right? And so when the Inflation Reduction Act was written, there are pieces of that call out, environmental justice communities, training for, to give an adder for tax credits for solar installation and building retrofits and things like that. Specifically projects in low income and underserved areas, right? So there are those things, but we can't forget that the entities who are most likely to need that or benefit from those covenants, they also need the support of the haves, right? The other people who are already standing up and saying, oh yeah, like I got my IRA projects lined up. We even found this within the higher education space in Pittsburgh, right? So I'm a member of the Higher Education Climate Consortium of Pittsburgh. We just created our first strategic plan, which we very specifically called the Strategic Plan for Equitable Climate Action. And equity in that context in Pittsburgh isn't necessarily racial equity, it's actually like access income equity, right? So working with the smaller colleges and universities that serve different types of students than Pitt and Carnegie Mellon and Duquesne normally serve, making sure that we're collaborating with the Community College of Allegheny County and helping them activate the IRA and know all the things that we know and our tax office knows about how to utilize that, right? working with Robert Morris University, Carlow University, and helping every university create and take advantage of those opportunities so they can serve their students better. And it's the same thing at the community level, right? Like if we really want to make sure that these benefits cascade all the way through our economy and to everybody who can benefit from them, we really need to all stand up and like look out for those people who want to take advantage of it, but don't have the upfront capital to wait for a tax credit direct pay back, right? We need to create the mechanism so they can benefit as well.
So I'm gonna play a little bit of an adversarial role here, and General, I'm gonna give this to you to take first. What do you say, or how do you respond to people that say, well, this isn't my thing? Sustainability and climate is not my job. If you are a admiral in the Navy, or if you're a general in the Marine Corps, and you say, you know what, I don't need to be concerned about climate or sustainability or how any of this works because my job is just X, Y, Z. This is outside of my bailiwick. How do you respond to that?
I transitioned from the Marine Corps in 2008, and I was looking for an opportunity to advocate and be a part of this movement that I saw that was, for me at that time, was centered on climate and food security. And I started being a part of events like this with ASP and Q and others. And one of the person who became one of my mentors on this was an old Virginia senator by the name of John Warner. I used to go to these events, and he'd look at me and say, "Hey, General," said, "you know, I'm just an old country lawyer. I used to take my pay in ham hocks and bacon." He was extremely sharp. And one of the stories he told was about that when he was about 16 years old, around during World War II, he had become a smoke trooper or a firefighter in Montana. And then, you know, later on he became a Marine. He was in the Navy, Secretary of the Navy, Senator. And he had an opportunity to go back to Idaho. And he said, "Hey, how about taking me to the area where I was a firefighter, 70 years ago, 60 years ago, whatever it was." And he went there, and he said tears came to his eyes as he saw the result of climate change and how it impacted him. You know, we were talking a moment ago about certain legislation. One of the things he also told me is that, you know, this is everybody's fight in terms of security. It's not just about, we always, you know, think about the military person, but it's not that. Another important legislation that's being looked at in Congress now is the Farm Bill. There are some very important elements in that Farm Bill. And I bring it up not because it's an outlier, but it is an integral part, just as important as this other legislation about our basic national security. You know, one of the deals about sequestering carbon is we absolutely have got to build a carbon market that the farmers will participate in. And that Farm Bill will go a long ways to doing that. And then when that happens, then we help reverse climate change, the 1.5 deal. And places that I went, I told you about Chad, but Horn of Africa, places in the Mideast where climate has forced people to flee because of food insecurity, and that has a domino effect where it causes conflict in areas that are already volatile because of age-old animosities and so forth. So it's all of our jobs, whether we're talking about the Farm Bill, or we're talking about other legislations, whether we're talking about the defense bill, whether we're talking about how we support our local cities such as Pittsburgh on the areas that they're trying to fund and resource in order to do their part in this overall effort to ensure our security. That's what I would say.
Yeah, so the only thing I want to add to that is, I think the federal government and the military has the benefit of being able to tell people, it's your job, right? You have to do this. We're gonna mandate it, you're part of the military, you do what I say, that sort of thing. I think a lot of Pittsburgh's sustainability story has been voluntary. And that's what maybe, Grant has told the story a lot, nationally and internationally. I think that's maybe what makes it so interesting to people outside of Pittsburgh, is that it is people making that decision voluntarily without sometimes any or much support from government or the economy to do something different and better and to rethink that in a way that is interesting and innovative and new. We did that in the building industry, we've done it with the polio vaccine, lots of things like that. It is just like rethinking it. And I think, one of the things that I find working in sustainability every day on a college campus is everybody has an idea of how to make change, right? And if you ask them what they think the opportunity is and start there, that's how you start the conversation. And everybody has their door into sustainability. You just have to figure out what it is. For some people, it might be saving money. For some people, it might be because they're, a fisherman or a hunter, something like that. Some people might not be on fire about climate change. Or love renewables, whatever it is. You just have to find that place and move it on.
I'd echo that. I mean, you have to, everybody in this room, and probably folks that are going to listen and watch this, are going to be a sustainability expert in one form or fashion, right? Just by your nature of consuming this sort of content. And so part of your job, I think, is to help create the big picture, the vision. What's the direction and which way are we going? How fast can we get there, right? But there's also this point of meeting people where they're at. Just two quick stories. Over the last 2 days, I've been doing legislative meetings, introducing our company and the work that we do in terms of building, effectively sustainable infrastructure solutions, right? So whether that's electric vehicle charging stations or solar and battery storage or rebuilding bridges and roads, these are the work that my company, S&P USA, does. In each of these meetings with legislators, I picked up little nuggets. Yesterday we were meeting with a Republican legislator from a suburban county, and he was asking me about electric vehicles. He's like, when are the subsidies going to start or stop? And what's this all about? So general kind of skepticism. But he also had this idea if you knew that the market is moving in that direction. And so we had this great conversation about power and electricity. And he said, you mean to tell me that these vehicles are powered by Pennsylvania electricity? And I was like, I wrote that down. And I was like, yes. And that was the common moment where he was like, this is a place where we can start to come together because he's, generally supporting the natural gas industry and understanding how the power works, in terms of us sourcing those local shale gas into the power markets to, heat and cool homes in the electrical grid here. That Pennsylvania power is a contributor to sustainability. It's not ultimately where folks, I think, in this room, know where you need to go and where we want to be, but it's a starting point, right? Same thing today, on the other end of the spectrum, meeting with a Democratic representative, a freshman, new to the Pennsylvania General Assembly, and he had that same type of moment. He was explaining how he has solar on his roof of his house, and he believes in public transit, and he started to make these dots connecting in terms of how he can go to the next level, in terms of thinking about policy that he can make with the transportation, Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, or the Turnpike Commission. So you could start to see the wheels turning in his head in terms of he's already made that first step. Now he's starting to take the next one. So I think that's part of the exciting thing of when we think about sustainability is that it's a journey and everyone's on a different path, but we can all start to push towards the same direction.
Great, thank you. So we've got about 20 minutes left, and I want to open it up in case anybody has any questions for our panelists. Does anybody have any questions? If not, I'm going to start peppering more questions. No? Okay. If anything comes to you, let me know.
We got any veterans out there? In the Army?
Yes, sir.
What was the biggest funeral this year? You see, we get to ask questions if you don't.
And that is fine. I think we started talking a little bit with Jessica before we started. And it depends on which operation you want to talk about. We can talk about Iraq, which was one of the biggest challenges, perhaps one of the large-scale combat operations that many of us refer to. And when we look at platforms, when we look at access and infrastructure in these nations that we are being called to go to, whether if it is for combat, whether it is for humanitarian civil assistance, the biggest challenge is reach and access. Not every partner nation has that. And as climate is becoming one of our national problems, it's a global issue. Because I have seen runways melting because of this, the heat that these countries are experiencing. I've seen countries like Chad, as you mentioned, that the lack of water is not a reality for just the local population, but it's also a reality for NGOs that we have operating in those areas, for armed forces, whether UN forces or even American forces. So that is a challenge that we as DOT are addressing, I know that for sure, because we need to have that reach to our forces in a timely manner. Because not only for fuels, but also for food. We're talking about beans, right? And so we need our forces to be sustained, starting with the water, starting with those food, and having what they're going to need to survive, to where they're not going to be, I would say, putting this stress on the local populace. But if the local populace don't have that access, so then how are we going to do it? And so I think it's great that Pittsburgh and all of you are addressing the local legislature and also approaching how we're going to sustain this city. But I think it's great if we also involve the industry and involve non-profit organizations to also get serious and start working with those developing nations, so they can bring their infrastructure up and their programs, and for them to also create legislation to where they're going to slow down carbon emission in order for them to contribute at a global level this climate change.
You're framing the initial challenge. Okay, you know, when I was growing up, my grandfather was still working mules. Okay, and he wasn't working them because, I mean, you know, it didn't have tractors or anything. There's an attitude, there's a culture, there's a thought, there's this momentum that carries through. And as we talked here today about the various challenges that we have, people want to say this is going to be clean. We can make all these electrical cars by 2030 or whatever, but this is going to be chaotic, and it's going to be start and stops. And what we need, again, is what we've talked about here today, is a combination of all elements of our society, local, state, and national, and the global, that you mentioned, in order to do that. And then, you know, in my time, in this 10 years, when I started out, I was common skepticism about this in the media and in other places that I talked with, and now there is an acceptance that wasn't there 10 or 12 years ago, that this is an issue and these are the things that we've got to do. The biggest issue, challenge right now is having a plan and getting everybody on that plan to go in that direction. The Department of Defense can do that because we're dictatorial, but the hardest part is civil society.
I just want to add something to that. So people love to ask me, maybe anybody in the sustainability world, what should I be doing, right? Like, what's the first thing that I should do? And my answer is usually, well, I don't know what you're already doing, so you should start by giving yourself credit there, and then figure out what is that next decision that you need to make as an individual, what's your influence, sort of going back to the legislator, and that sort of thing. And I think about that a lot with undergraduates too. I always say, like, think about where you're gonna live. If you're gonna buy a house, how close are you to where you're gonna work or the urban center? That has transportation things. Just today, senior leader at Pitt, we were having a meeting about something else, and she was like, should I buy an electric vehicle? And I was like, absolutely, right? We make these decisions as individuals and organizations and governments every day. And some of these decisions, when we make them, you lock it in for a decade or more, right? Maybe 2 decades, depending on how long I've had my current cars. But I think just rethinking some of these things and knowing that every decision you make, that's an important inflection point, right? You can be making a better decision. It may not be the best decision that you want to make. Maybe whatever we're doing, and Chad, we're not able to fully electrify standalone net zero energy building yet. But, we do what we need to do, right, in that place, in that space at the time.
So I'm gonna take a page out of your book, Andrew, and pose the question about China. Oh, do you have a question?
Well, it's more like a question comment.
Okay.
Just based off how the conversation started with, how we're updating our different installations and facilities. So just hearing the conversation about how we're doing the buildings, and then yes, I'm active in the military right now. So lived on posts and understand that in some of the posts we have old housing. So that's how my brain's thinking the whole time you're talking. So in some of the posts we're now updating them because we have old housing that's no longer adequate for our veterans and families, and soldier housing, we're updating that. So I'm thinking about the fact that so it's a Fort Lewis and we have brand new housing, and you're right, the Army has the DoD has the ability to dictate how they'll do things. And the DoD has always been a standard bearer for the rest of the country, we're doing this and this is how it's working. So, but no idea how the legislative side of it works, but if you worked with a post in rebuilding one of the posts that's already going through updating changes to support the families and implementing those plans, that's a showcase for the rest of the country that we're doing this with our military, our veterans, and it's an easy way to collect the data to show that this is working. So, but I know it always becomes what flavor of the month for whatever jail or whatever is approving the plan, that it does need funding. But that's just where my brain is going with it. I think it's an amazing idea that would work.
So I love that comment / that hybrid comment question. And it made me think of one of the last projects I had at the city of Pittsburgh, and that was Firehouse 8. I'm gonna look at Sarah in the audience who worked with me at the city about this. And the reason why I think about this is that, just like you said, we have a knowledge base now where we have all the information and all the tools in terms of how to build high quality facilities that are livable, are sustainable, are high performance from an energy, water, social economic whatever factor that you want to put in, we can build that now. And we don't. And we don't because there's 2 sides of the coin. I think there's a lot of entrenched interest and perceptions around how we should build and what we should build. Pittsburgh Art Commission. And there's also, I don't work there anymore, so I'm a little freewheel here. And that they think of things from a design standpoint the way we thought about things in 1980. And the challenges that we're up against, are deeper than what they were in 1980 I just used 1980 as a flashpoint, but in terms of what we need to accomplish from a building energy standpoint and from a material standpoint. And the other side of that is one of the lessons is that you have to have early engagement and listen to the consumers of those facilities, the people that are in them every day so that they can be optimized, so they can be their best selves, right? And so understanding the needs of a family or the needs of what the practitioners have in terms of their job or their duty, build the facilities to kind of meet that moment for them, I think is really critical. And all forms of government in the private sector, I think, have to change and do it quickly. Because we are stuck in a mentality of building the current building the way that we built the last one, even though we have an open book in terms of what's required to kind of pass the test.
That said, some of these answers are very simple, and if you ask anybody in the building industry, they're gonna tell you right away, net zero passive house. Like, that's what it is, if you're doing that project today, right? The military should be doing that everywhere, right? Ultra high performing. Drive it down, passive house is a building standard, it's performance based, it sets the amount of energy consumption and the ventilation rate for the building at a set standard, and then it's, because it's performance based, the design and construction team just go after it, it's tested. At the end, it creates a more comfortable house for the people who use it, way lower energy usage, sometimes 10% of what a standard like house or dorm or building uses, and equivalent cost upfront, maybe a little upfront if you've got a team who hasn't done it before. Like, and then you layer solar on it and you got net zero. Like, why are we not doing this all over? Because people need to get to change, right? And so it's that part of the system that we really need to tweak.
Just one comment that to follow up on that would be this. I invited one of my Brit friends that I went through NATO Defense College with to visit me on the 4th of July. And he came over with his family, and I had stayed in their house over there too, and you know, different attitudes. He followed me around in my farmhouse as I went through there, turning off the lights in my house. He would challenge me on my energy use. So you know. When I stayed in a place in England, I like to froze to death. But they're used to it because they've changed their culture because they see the need to, because they have to in terms of cost to do that. So we call it a significant emotional event. So we have to continue to generate significant emotional events so that we can change how people operate.
First of all, thanks so much for bringing this event to Pittsburgh. I think that there's been so much that the world can learn from our history, and Grant and Aurora touched a little bit on this, and there's a big movement here that's extrapolatable to other places, yet simultaneously we can learn from other places in the world that are doing this a little bit better. So thanks for bringing this in the first part. And Grant, I just wanted to touch on what you said a minute ago about it's a 4-sector problem. A lot of this obviously is dealt with the public sector, this discussion about the national security threat. We've talked about NGOs, and we've talked about the academic sector, like looking into this. But the private sector is something that's a really huge component to this. And, that's almost a little bit of a microcosm of Pittsburgh. There's probably some folks in here that would agree that getting the private sector off the sidelines to participate in some of these things is a challenge. It's a challenge in Pittsburgh, and that's a comment about the world in general too. So I run a nonprofit here in Pittsburgh that deals with like responsible technology and ethical uses of AI, et cetera. And I cannot now not open my email every day. And actually we were having this conversation a little bit earlier as we were informally standing around about the private sector and like how much energy like AWS server farms are using for like building the cloud. And now every day it's ChatGPT, and like the amount of energy that something like this is generating on the back end. So my comment is how, like for the private sector, what could really be done? Because so much of this has been talking about like buildings and the physical infrastructure, but the operations too, for some companies use a ton of energy. So just what are your general thoughts about how we could be, apart from just like regulating, but how could we be encouraging? How could we be talking about this? How could I be out in the streets working with companies to say like, this is an issue, and it's multi-pronged in terms of the problems it could cause. So basically like private sector, public sector.
I want to give a preamble to whatever Grant's going to say. Well, because I think the private sector is there now. And I will say finally, right? And so carbon commitments are a really good example where higher education was way out early, governments way out early on making carbon commitments, maybe that they had no idea of how to really reach, but they were like, we need to do this and we need to be out there. There have been people working on this for decades. All of a sudden, over the past, I would say, 5 years, and you see this in Grant's title, he's at the ESG and innovation, right? So ESG is all of a sudden like everywhere, and people are like, well, is what you do ESG? Because I'm the executive director of sustainability. I'm like, look, sustainability is the work, ESG is the reporting, right? Because all of a sudden the private sector is like, shoot, investors are asking us how to do this. We need to report on this via ESG. And I think it's great, and I think it's important, but there's science behind all of this work, right? So the important thing in the carbon space is the science-based target initiative, right? Which actually like goes and makes sure that all the claims that the private sector is putting out there, and I'm just using carbon as an example, are verifiable, that are based in science, that they're actually achievable, and that they meet the needs that we need to meet. But I think it's an important conversation, but maybe 20 years too late.
That's a great preamble, and super helpful. So, yeah, a couple things, because, I had a role similar to Aurora's just at the city, and then transitioned over the last year. So I'm going to tell you what I've learned over the last year on my private sector holiday. And it's probably going to be longer than a holiday because I'm really enjoying it. One is that, just let's break down ESG real quickly. So environmental, social, and governance. You also see in some news channels right now that there's a conflict with this. And so I want to address that up front with just saying, basically, when you're talking about ESG, you're talking about continuous improvement for your company, okay? And so the E is obviously the environment. How are you a steward of both the place where you're operating your business and the places that you're providing services? That's number one. S, that's all about the people that you employ and the people that you serve. And the G is basically, are you a responsibly run business? Now, there's a whole bunch of minutia underneath of all that, but that's basically trying to demystify what ESG is, right? And my company, S&P USA, so we are an infrastructure development and construction company. What does that mean? So we have 4 business verticals, which are project finance. We invest in infrastructure assets. Energy, we build and maintain renewable energy assets and battery storage assets. Electric mobility, EV transportation systems, and also self-performing construction, which is dirty. And so that's why I'm here. And so what's really exciting about this, though, is so construction is, by its very nature, a carbon-intense business. So steel, concrete, 2 of the most carbon-intense materials in the world. We deal with that daily, building bridges, building locks and dams, ports and waterways, roads, etc. We also have a 1,200 unit fleet that is about 200 off-road or on-road vehicles, and the remainder are heavy equipment. Angela's getting that data right now. And so what we are starting to do, though, is set our baseline. We're at the beginning part of our journey. And so that's an indication, one, of leadership and the importance of whatever organization you're in, are starting to set that direction. And the reason why we're saying that direction is twofold. One, we're in the construction industry, and a lot of our clients are public sector clients, TOTs, port operators, municipalities, etc. And so we know that they, apropos of this conversation we've had, are going in that direction. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. The other side of it is that we operate in the financial markets. So we provide, we are a P3 project financer. So we invest private capital into public infrastructure. So one of our largest projects right now is a climate resilience project in Fargo, North Dakota, where we're building a 30-mile flood diversion channel with 19 bridge spans. The civil engineers tell me it's just a ditch grant. And it's really awesome. Our CEO is like, we're building a river. The engineers are like, it's just a ditch. But effectively, we're moving a massive amount of earth to prevent the constant flooding that happens in Fargo, North Dakota, and Moorhead, Minnesota. In fact, our team members today, and tomorrow are filling sandbags right now, because the ditch isn't done yet. But we're filling sandbags to help the community get ready for the oncoming flood events. And so that's a part of like our corporate social responsibility, because we're also living in Fargo, North Dakota. We're members of the community too. And so I think that there is a stewardship component from the private sector, whether it's providing capital, or whether it's providing responsible operations. And Aurora's right, like we're moving in that direction at a very rapid rate. What will accelerate that is when the private sector also starts to ask for those products. So just like what Fargo, North Dakota asked for in terms of the creation of a flood diversion channel, they did it in a way that also asked to do it with green financing. So we have the largest green bond that we brought to the table to help finance our portion of the financial stack along with the local component. They agreed to tax themselves to build this flood diversion channel, and then a contribution from the U.S. Army Corps. So there's three major financial investors in that project that is going to alleviate flooding, for those cities there in North Dakota. So part of it's the solution, part of it's the capital, but also part of it is pushing in the right direction so that we can build climate solutions in an expedited way.
Well, I'm sorry to say we are just about out of time, but just a little ASP plug. We recently did a webinar and put out a couple of briefing notes, which are just small, palatable, digestible products that talk about hard to abate sectors, so steel, cement, aviation fuel, things like that. So check that out. Thank you all so much for being here today. If you have questions, please feel free to find us afterward. And I will give it over to each of our panelists for the final word.
Final word.
Final word. I'll drop some wisdom. First of all, thank you guys for being here. It's exciting to have a group of citizens who are interested in these topics, and you're going to carry this information on into the work that you do. I think one of the things I would just underscore that is the challenge in front of us, particularly from a national security standpoint. The general mentioned Norfolk, Virginia. So we have an office in Virginia Beach, and we're looking at projects right there that are effectively addressing the coastal resilience. And so to put that in perspective, because of climate change, our nuclear naval fleet, NATO operations are all there in the Tidewater region. And so when those folks who live and work in those facilities are affected by a climate event, that means they might not be able to get to work, they might be inundated or disposed because of a weather-borne activity, and our climate infrastructure, our military infrastructure is at risk, right? And so when we think about these issues, they become very real from a standpoint of not just planning and financing, but of building that infrastructure. And there's going to be more and more instances now and in the future where this key national security infrastructure is at risk. And so these aren't hypotheticals. These are real world incidents that we have to deal with. And so the lessons from the DoD and from cities are also a force multiplier, going back to, how do we build better facilities for our service personnel? And so we have to start applying these lessons in a more rapid fashion. And I think that's one of the things that, folks in this room can help do. So.
I don't know if this is really a great closing thought, but I think, there are many solutions, innovations that have come out of the military and Department of Defense, and I think we need more of those in this space. Right? You mentioned sustainable aviation. That is a real challenge, even at the university carbon footprint level, right? That is not something, I'm not going to get faculty to stop flying to talk about their research all over the world, nor do I want to, right? So knowing that there are things that we have to do in that space, and knowing that the military is sort of like the front lines of, delivering, air service around the world and requiring it, but also a top user of that, that's an opportunity But I think where Department of Defense and military can lead and help everybody else and continue to drive innovation in this space in a way that the private sector, government, higher education, nonprofits would never be able to get to on their own.
I talked about the military, and I'll talk about the civilian. There is a great threat to our national security, and it's not military. We've seen a test of it with the pandemic, but because of the climate change, we're seeing, for instance, the flight paths, the wildlife changing. Part of what caused the rise in egg prices in poultry was the fact that those flyways were pushed over the area of greatest concentration of poultry production in the United States. We're seeing a big increase in the amount of avian flu that are in wildlife. That increase causes the likelihood of mutations to increase. I had a conversation with Dr. Bob Redfield, the former CDC, and his greatest fear is that the avian flu will mutate and move back into human population with a much, much greater mortality rate. So again, let's not over-concentrate on one particular area. We need to have the broader view. It's the military, it's the civilian, it's private, it's commercial, it's government. We all need to synchronize our actions, recognize the threats, and act accordingly. It's not going to be pretty, but it is something that we have to continue to work with every day in order to be successful and to ensure our ultimate national security.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
All right, we're down. Really? Yeah.